next door. So this is 14th Avenue. Carvel would be here to the right with the Cross Island crossing over here. Here we see some children playing in the middle of the road, and you see that the road is made out of dirt. It's not even paved. Whitestone would not get paved roads until the late 1920s, early 1930s. And even then, most of the neighborhood was not paved, only major intersections and throughways. But side streets and the like were still made out of dirt or rocky paths. To the left here are two general stores. Here you have a home, and here you have a little candy store. And today, these two structures are gone, and the backyard of this property is now the parking lot of the 7-Eleven off of 14th. That's why there's a parking lot, and that's why 7-Eleven is recessed all the way in the back, because these two structures were removed and allowed for all that space. And you see here in the background, there's a delivery, a food delivery. It's being done by horse and wagon. So this is really before the advent of the automobile. So this is another great shot looking down 150th Street. That's the funeral home. That's Glease's funeral home. Very historic building. This was done in what is known as the Queen Anne style of architecture. It was a very popular type of architecture here in Whitestone and in mainly northern Queens and Flushing. The funeral home actually was very good to me when I was doing the book. In the lower level of the funeral home is like a parlor, and they have many old photos and artifacts of Whitestone on the walls. So they were very helpful when doing this project, because they had a lot of good stuff that I wouldn't have found anywhere else. So this, jumping around a little bit, as the population in Whitestone expanded, more homes and property were needed. So developers looked west of Whitestone, because you already had Beechers, you already had the main part of Whitestone, which is the old part of town. So the only undeveloped part was to the west. So buyers went there, land developers went there, and created the town of Malba. Malba is, in case you're wondering where the name Malba comes from, it's the first initial of the 5 developers who started the town. It's the initial of their first name. All right, it was first started by William Ziegler, who was the sugar and flour king of the United States. He controlled the largest producer of sugar and flour, and he bought all of that property that consists of Malba and commissioned for the town to be built. It was then, as it is now, an exclusive private community. Here, this image that we're looking at is taken from the pier, which was the old ferry pier. Before the Whitestone Bridge, before there was any connection between Whitestone and the Bronx. Now we have 2 connections. We have the Frog's Neck and the Whitestone Bridge. But before that, the only way to get there was by ferry boat. So people would pick up the ferry here from this pier. And if you see over here is this little round space over here. That's still there to this very day. If you go down in Malba towards the water by the Whitestone Bridge, there's a huge driving circle with a big flagpole in the middle, and it has a beautiful view of the Whitestone Bridge, and that's, excuse me, that's where this photo is taken, and these 2 homes actually are still there. If you notice, they're the only 2 homes on this property overlooking the water, but now, although other homes surround them, these 2 homes still remain. And the ferry existed until the day that the Whitestone Bridge opened. And on the day that the Whitestone Bridge opened, that very morning, as they were cutting the ribbon, the last ferry departed to go from Whitestone to Ferry Point in the Bronx. This is a shore road. This is now Powell's Cove Boulevard. This is just another example of the beautiful homes built by the Shore Acres Realty Company in 1906. A lot of these homes by the 40s were, some of them actually were torn down, and then others were built in their place, bigger homes that could house more people as the population grew. Here's another great shot of 150th Street. And now, as we see, the horse and buggy are gone, and we start to see cars coming into the area. It was then, as it is now, lined with shops and stores and businesses from either side. This brick building here to the right is the True Value hardware store that is there today. But when this photo was taken, the building, which is now the True Value hardware, was a theater. It was a silent movie house called Gerson's Unique Theater. And they would put on plays and run silent movies in this building. So, although the structures to the left may not be recognizable, I'm sure this one is. This is now, it's now, what was the Stone Tavern? What is it now? It's the Still Stone Tavern. Okay. So, this is the National Bank of Whitestone. Each neighborhood had their own bank. And the currency that you would get at this bank would actually have the neighborhood printed on it where it came from. So there are bills out there that actually say $20 bill or $100 bill, and on the bottom it would say National Bank of Whitestone, or National Bank of Bayside, or National Bank of Flushing. So here's a picture of the bank. You have a trolley zooming by, going down 150th towards 14th Avenue. Here in front of the bank, you notice a light post. This is a very special light post because it's not electric, it's gas. This is a gas lamp, all right? Before there was electricity, which came in the early 1920s, from the mid-1800s until the 1920s, so for about 60 years, all of the public lighting in the street was gas. And they would actually have people, they were not automatic, they had to be done manually. So you had people who worked for the Queens Gas Company come and go, just like how garbage men go from property to property and pick up the garbage and make their rounds. Well, you would have people come and make the rounds and go from property to property turning on these gas lanterns. There was a valve at the top. They would unscrew the top and turn on the valve, releasing the gas, and then screw the top back on, and they would go from block to block doing this. The biggest gas lantern was in the middle of 14th Avenue and 150th Street. It was suspended above the intersection. A man would come and undo the light, which was on a rope, bring the rope down, the light would lower to the intersection, he would light it, and then pull it back up where it was suspended above the intersection and lock it into place. So this is what we had to do years ago just to get lighting in the street. This is another great shot of the National Bank, all right? This is from the back of the postcard. It says that this is actually the opening week of the bank. You have a market to the right. These buildings to the right, actually, that are connected to the bank still exist today. We have a beautiful old automobile in the bottom right. So this is the Firehouse. Whitestone has a great history with the fire department. This is the new modern firehouse that was erected right where the Cross Island Parkway is today. When the Cross Island Parkway was built several years later in the late 30s, the building was going to be demolished. But it was too modern for the time for it to be taken down, because they would have lost all of the modern conveniences and equipment. So, and they really couldn't find a place to relocate this firehouse. So what the city did was they raised the entire building on a platform and physically moved the building inch by inch, very slowly. It took hours, maybe even a couple of days, all the way to the present day location where it is in back of Carvel, right off of 14th Avenue. So, before, now that photo that I just showed you, that was a photo of the FDNY in front of the firehouse. But before the consolidation of New York City in 1898, before the creation of the 5 boroughs, there was no FDNY. There was no NYPD. There were no direct city agencies. So all of these were independent volunteer agencies. For example, the fire department. So Whitestone had its own fire department. College Point had its own fire department. Flushing had 3 or 4 separate fire departments. And this one, our local fire department before 1898 was called the Columbia Hose Company. The Columbia Hose Company. And this is the members of the Columbia Hose Fire Company in 1892, and they're doing what's known as a hose race. They would have the fire hose and the spindle that it comes on, and then they would start from the beginning, and they would compete with other local fire departments. It was kind of like a relay race, and they would do this for prizes, for a big trophy, and it was something very common. They would compete back and forth. An interesting story about the local fire departments of that time, from the 1880s and the 1890s, since it was a volunteer thing, the glory was not necessarily in the way of money, but it was in the way of who put out the biggest fire and how quickly they would respond. And there was a fire company, it was actually this fire company, the Columbia Hose, that was putting out a lot of fires. Numerous fires were breaking out, and they were always the first ones on the scene. And a reporter from the New York Times noticed this great feat by the local fire company. So he decided to investigate, and what he found out was that one of its members was setting the fires. He would wait for the family to leave, he would set the home on fire, and within the nick of time, the Columbia Hose Company would arrive to save the day. We're actually experiencing a little bit of the Columbia Hose Company right now, because their building was right here, where we are today. This was the Oddfellows Hall, and before it was Oddfellows Hall, it was one of the locations of the Columbia Hose Company. Downstairs is where they kept the fire brigade, which was not a fire truck, it was a horse connected to a huge apparatus, okay, that mounted hoses and equipment, and the Columbia Hose Company would be dispatched right from this very building that we're sitting in tonight. The way that fires were detected in those days was at the top of the building, or to the left or the right of the building was a huge watchtower. And somebody would go up there in shifts and watch, and they had a clear 360 view of all the surrounding neighborhoods and the towns. So a fire could be seen easily. Then he would ring a bell, the fire department would jump into action, and off they would run to put out the fire. This is an interesting photo, the next three photos. This is the Columbia Hose Company, again. This photo was taken by Weber, Frederick Weber of Jamaica, Queens. Frederick Weber was a prolific photographer of Queens and Brooklyn, and it's to him that we have to thank for many of the historic images of Queens. He took thousands of images, and most of them, thank God, have been preserved. So this is a picture of the men of the Columbia Hose Company putting on a minstrel play. All right, this photo was taken in 1912. It has the name of the play at the bottom, called That Hungry Pickaninny. Pickaninny is a derogatory term for African Americans, and they would, the plays that were put on, the minstrel shows in early American culture, it was custom for white people to put on blackface, and they would go and they would act and they would do songs that were mainly popular in the black community. And it was, obviously today it's a very prejudicial thing to do. So, but in that time it was very common and it was part of the culture. If you notice, the two women, the female baby and the woman to the right are men. It's an all-male cast. This is next photo. So here in the next photo, as you see, once again, you have the men of the Columbia Hose Company. They're dressed up as a band. They were originally, for the photo, they were regular like this, but when they put on the play, they would be all in blackface. We have, again, the very, not very politically correct name of the band is the Darktown Silver-Plated Brass Band. Darktown, obviously referring to a community that would be dominantly African American. Again, this is a product of the time in which these people lived. This little theater was at the Columbia Club, which is right off of 12th, which was right off of 12th and 150th Street. And I believe today, where the Columbia Hose Company stood, is now the Masonic Hall, which is, it now stands on that very property. The next photo is interesting, not only because it's another image of another minstrel performance by the Columbia Hose Company, Well, what is, so here we go, the Columbia Hose Company Minstrels. So here's everybody dressed up. You have the stage lighting on the bottom. This was not electric, these were candles that were lit, okay, to provide lighting for the stage. But what's even interesting is the date of the photo is April 11th, 1912. This is 4 days before the Titanic sank, is when this photo was taken. So I thought it was pretty incredible. So moving past that now, we get to this, another rare image. This is a building which still stands on the corner of 150th Street and 14th Avenue. Excuse me, 150th Street and the Cross Island Parkway. Okay, across from the bar Shenanigans, all right? So the Cross Island would be here with the photographer standing, and this building housed the post office. The reason it housed the post office is because this building was very close to a particular location. It was only 20 or 30 feet from it, to be exact, and it was 20 or 30 feet from the railroad. Which brings us to what my favorite subject matter of Whitestone is the Long Island Railroad that used to service our town. A lot of people are not aware that Whitestone had a railroad, but we did. We had one from 1869 all the way to 1932. And I've met people who rode that railroad as a kid. This is so that previous photo of the post office, the reason that post office was there, because it was a few feet away from the Whitestone train station. So mail would be brought out of the post office, they would walk to the footbridge, which is now the overpass over the Cross Island, and lower the mail down into the train, and then the train would take off with the mail. This is the Long Island Railroad Depot at Whitestone Landing. We mentioned that Whitestone Landing before is now Beechurst. So this is the first station, the first stop on the Whitestone line. This is now the wall bounce off of 154th Street where Cascarino's is. So when you're sitting in Cascarino's and you look out through the front of the store, which is all glass, right in the parking lot is where this scene would have taken place. So Tropicana would be where this little water tower is in the background, and 154th Street would be to the right. So the train is running parallel to 154th Street. And the way that it would go, excuse me, the train would begin at this point. It was part of the Flushing North Side Railroad, the Whitestone branch.